The bathroom mirror at Aurelius was unforgiving. Ara Vance turned sideways, then forward again, tugging at the hem of the midnight green wrap dress she'd spent 3 hours choosing. The fabric clung in all the wrong places. Or maybe every place was the wrong place when you carried 230 pounds on a 5-foot 6-inch frame. She'd bought this dress 11 months ago for a birthday dinner that never happened. It had hung in her closet like a promise she kept breaking to herself. She pressed her palms flat against the marble countertop and took a breath. The bathroom at Aurelius smelled like bergamot and money. Even the hand towels were monogrammed. This was not the kind of place where Ara belonged, and her body knew it, even if her stubborn mind refused to accept it. Through the bathroom door, she could hear the low hum of the restaurant. Silverware against porcelain, a woman's laugh, bright and careless, the sommelier describing a burgundy with the reverence of a priest reading scripture. Out there at table 4 by the window, her chair sat empty beside a glass of sparkling water she'd barely touched. Her blind date was supposed to arrive 15 minutes ago. She was reaching for her phone when the bathroom door opened and 2 women walked in. They wore that specific kind of beauty that required professional maintenance, all sharp collarbones and tailored silk. The taller one, a redhead with a diamond tennis bracelet, didn't notice Ara standing by the far sink. Or if she did, she didn't register her as someone worth acknowledging. "Did you see the girl at table 4? The redhead said, checking her lipstick in the mirror. "The one sitting alone?" "Oh God, the big one in the green dress." Her friend, a blonde in cream cashmere, wrinkled her nose. "She's been staring at her phone for 20 minutes. I think she's been stood up." "Can you blame him? Honestly, Aurelius isn't exactly the place you bring someone like that. The chairs here barely fit normal people." They both laughed. It was a small, shared laugh, the kind exchanged between women who had never worried about whether a chair would hold them. Ara's fingers tightened around the edge of the countertop. She didn't move. She didn't breathe. She stared at a fixed point on the wall and waited for them to leave. The way she'd waited out comments like these her entire life. In locker rooms, at family dinners, in fitting rooms where saleswomen smiled with their mouths but not their eyes. The women left without washing their hands. Ara released her grip on the counter. Her knuckles had gone white. She looked at herself one final time in the mirror and saw exactly what they saw. A plus-size woman in a dress that was trying too hard, waiting for a man who was probably never coming. She should leave. She could slip out the side entrance, order Thai food on the way home, and delete the dating app that had matched her with someone named A. Sterling. First initial only. No photo, just a profile that read, "I value substance over performance." If you can hold a conversation about Caravaggio and cryptocurrency in the same breath, we might get along. She'd been charmed by that. She was an idiot. Ara smoothed her dress one final time and walked back into the restaurant. She would finish her water, pay for it, even though sparkling water at Aurelius probably cost $14, and leave with whatever dignity the evening had left her. She was halfway to her table when she saw them. Beatrice Vance Morrow sat at a table near the entrance, her posture a masterclass in performative elegance. Back straight, chin lifted, a glass of champagne catching the candlelight. Beside her in a red bodycon dress that left nothing to the imagination, sat Cressa, Ara's stepsister, scrolling through her phone with the practiced boredom of someone who believed the world owed her its attention. Ara's stomach dropped. This was not a coincidence. Beatrice didn't do coincidences. "Ara, darling," Beatrice called out, her voice carrying across the restaurant with the precision of a stage actress. Several heads turned. "What a wonderful surprise. We had no idea you'd be here." Ara stopped walking, fight or flight, and her heels were too new for flight. "Hello, Beatrice." "Sit down, sit down." Beatrice gestured to their table with the magnanimity of a queen granting an audience. "Cressa, move your bag. Make room for your sister." "Stepsister," Ara corrected quietly. Cressa didn't look up from her phone. "I thought you said you were staying home tonight." "I had plans." "Plans?" Beatrice's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise. She scanned the restaurant, her gaze landing on the empty chair at table 4. Oh, sweetheart, you're on a date." The way she said it, not with cruelty, not exactly, but with the devastating gentleness of someone delivering a terminal diagnosis. "I'm meeting someone." "Yes, someone from that app." Cressa finally looked up, amusement curling the corners of her mouth. "The one where you have to use photos from 5 years ago." My photos are current. Beatrice reached across and patted Ara's hand. Her rings were cold against Ara's skin. Darling, I'm only saying this because I love you. Look around this room. Look at the women here. She paused. Then look at yourself. Ara looked. She didn't want to, but she looked, and she saw what Beatrice wanted her to see. That every woman in Aurelius was a size 4 or smaller, that the chairs were narrow and elegant, that the lighting was designed for cheekbones and not for her. You deserve someone who appreciates you, Beatrice continued, her voice rising just enough for the neighboring tables to hear. But sweetheart, you have to be realistic. A man who makes a reservation at Aurelius isn't looking for... She let the sentence trail off, which was worse than finishing it. For what, Beatrice? Oh, don't make me say it. Beatrice leaned forward, and this was her masterwork. The concerned stepmother, the voice of reason, the woman who only wanted what was best. Cressa, tell your sister. Cressa tilted her head, appraising Ara the way one might examine a garment that had been washed too many times. She means no one from this world is going to show up for you, Ara. Not at a place like this. He probably drove past, saw you through the window, and kept going. It's not personal. It's just math. Actually, Cressa added, tapping her phone, I heard the Sterlings are being matched through some exclusive service. If your date is actually a Sterling, I guarantee you he took one look at the situation. And the situation, Ara repeated, and she hated the tremor in her voice. She hated that after 28 years of this, after a lifetime of Beatrice's calibrated cruelty, it still landed every time, right between the ribs. Oh, honey. Beatrice leaned forward. I just don't want you to sit here all night alone while the whole restaurant watches. That's the cruelest thing of all, isn't it? Hope. Something fractured behind Ara's sternum. Not her heart. She'd reinforced that long ago. Something else. The small, reckless thing that had made her put on this dress tonight and believe for a few dangerous hours that she deserved to sit in a place like this and be chosen. Perhaps you're right, Ara said, and her voice was steady even as her vision blurred. Perhaps I should... Excuse me. The voice came from behind her, low, unhurried, with the particular calm of someone who had never in his life needed to raise his voice to command a room. Every syllable was perfectly weighted, like a legal argument delivered without notes. Ara turned. The man standing 3 feet away was tall, over 6 feet, with dark hair cut close and the kind of jaw that sculptors invented. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him the way expensive things fit people who could afford them. Not like a costume, but like a second skin. His eyes were dark brown, nearly black, and they were fixed on Ara with an intensity that made the air between them feel solid. He was not looking at Beatrice. He was not looking at Cressa, though Cressa had already straightened in her chair, had already tucked her hair behind her ear, had already done that thing she did where her entire body became an invitation. He was looking at Ara. I apologize for the delay, he said, still looking only at her. Traffic on Commonwealth was worse than usual. Ara stared at him, her mouth open, but nothing came out. Beatrice recovered first. And you are? He didn't turn to face her. He extended his hand to Ara instead, a gesture so deliberate it was almost theatrical. Alistair Sterling, I believe we have a table. The name landed like a stone in the still water. Cressa's phone slipped from her fingers and clattered against her plate. Beatrice's champagne glass paused midway to her lips. Alistair Sterling, not just a Sterling. The Sterling, founder and CEO of Sterling Meridian Capital, whose net worth the financial papers estimated at somewhere between 4 and 7 billion, depending on which quarter you checked. Cressa stood up so fast her chair scraped against the marble floor. She smoothed her dress. She smiled the smile she'd practiced 10,000 times in mirrors. Mr. Sterling, I'm Cressa Vance, Ara's sister. I have to say it's such a pleasure to finally... I wasn't speaking to you. Alistair didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words carried the flat, surgical precision of someone who had ended careers with less. His eyes remained on Ara. Shall we? But Ara hadn't moved. Something about his timing, his entrance, his precise intervention at her lowest moment felt choreographed. And Ara, for all her insecurities, was not stupid. How long were you watching? She asked. Something shifted in his expression. A flicker of surprise, quickly masked. I beg your pardon. You heard me. Our reservation was for 7:30. It's 7:52. You weren't late because of traffic. You were already here. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silence. This one had edges. Beatrice and Cressa exchanged a glance, sensing an unexpected shift in the evening's script. Alistair Sterling looked at Ara for a long, measured moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, the corner of his mouth lifted. Not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. "Corner booth by the kitchen entrance," he said. "I arrived at 7:15. So you sat there for 37 minutes and watched me wait. Watch them." She gestured toward the bathroom, toward the women who'd laughed about table 4, and then toward Beatrice and Cressa. "Yes." "Why?" He tilted his head slightly, considering her the way one might consider an unexpected variable in an otherwise predictable equation. "Because I wanted to see who you were before you knew I was watching." The honesty of it stunned her. Not because it was kind, it wasn't, but because it was the first fully honest thing anyone had said to her all evening. Beatrice laughed, a thin sound meant to reclaim control. "Well, that's rather cold, isn't it? Watching a woman suffer while you sit in the corner like some sort of—" "Mrs. Vance Morrow," Alistair said, and for the first time he looked at Beatrice. The temperature at the table seemed to drop several degrees. "Your husband, Richard Vance, filed for Chapter 11 restructuring last month. His real estate portfolio has been bleeding since the Meridian Tower deal collapsed. I know this because my firm declined to bail him out." He paused, letting the information settle. "I imagine that's why your stepdaughter is suddenly interesting to you, not as a person, but as a potential point of access." Beatrice's face drained of color. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish pulled from water. Cressa's smile had curdled. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about. It's what I do for a living." Alistair turned back to Ara. "Table 4. Ara looked at him. She looked at Beatrice's ashen face. She looked at Cressa's hands clenched around her phone like a lifeline, and she felt something she hadn't expected. Not gratitude, not relief, but a cold, clear anger at all of them. At Beatrice for the cruelty, at Cressa for the complicity, and at this man, this stranger who had watched her humiliation like a nature documentary and then swooped in when the narrative suited him. "Tour," she said, not because he'd rescued her, but because she wanted answers. They sat across from each other in the warm glow of a single candle. The waiter appeared, disappeared with their drink orders, and reappeared with a precision that suggested Alistair Sterling was the kind of client restaurants trained their staff to anticipate. Up close, Ara noticed things the initial shock had masked. A thin scar along his left jawline, almost invisible, the kind earned in adolescence. The way his hand stayed perfectly still on the table. No fidgeting, no gestures, an absolute economy of movement. And his eyes, those nearly black eyes, which watched her with an attention that felt less like attraction and more like assessment. "You're angry," he observed. "I'm curious. There's a difference." "Not always. You watched them humiliate me and you didn't intervene." "No. And your justification for that is—" "I didn't say I had a justification. I said I wanted to see who you were." He leaned back slightly in his chair. "Most people, when publicly humiliated by family, either crumble or retaliate. You did neither. You absorbed it, processed it, and were about to leave on your own terms. That told me more about your character in 3 minutes than 6 months of dating would have. That's a convenient rationalization for sitting on your hands. Perhaps, but you're still here." Ara held his gaze. He was right, and that was the most infuriating part. She was still here, not because of his face or his money or the way the suit fit his shoulders, though she was not blind, and the suit did fit his shoulders exceptionally well. She was here because Alistair Sterling, in his own clinical way, was the first person tonight who had treated her like an equal. He hadn't pitied her, he hadn't patronized her, he had observed her and drawn conclusions. And while his methods were questionable, his assessment had been precise. "Tell me about the profile," she said. "Caravaggio and cryptocurrency. That was specific. It was a filter. Most people swipe based on photographs. I wanted someone who would respond to ideas." He paused. "You wrote 3 paragraphs about Judith beheading Holofernes and its implications for modern feminist iconography. Your analysis was better than most doctoral theses I've read." "You've read doctoral theses on Caravaggio?" "I funded 3. None of them were as interesting as your 3 paragraphs." It wasn't a compliment. Not exactly. It was a statement of fact delivered with the same flat certainty he'd used to dismantle Beatrice. And yet, for the first time all evening, Ara felt something warm uncurl in her chest. The dinner lasted 2 hours. They talked about art, not just Caravaggio, but Artemisia Gentileschi, about the economics of the auction house system, about whether NFTs had permanently damaged the relationship between digital creators and collectors. They argued about Rothko. Ara said Rothko's late work was the visual equivalent of a sustained chord in music. Color has emotional frequency. Alistair said Rothko was a glorified wallpaper designer. They argued for 20 minutes about this, and somewhere in the middle of it, Ara forgot to be self-conscious about her body, about the green dress, about the way the candlelight fell on her face. She forgot because Alistair wasn't looking at any of those things. He was looking at her mind, following her arguments the way a chess player follows an opponent's strategy, with focus, respect, and something that might have been delight. When the dessert plates were cleared and the restaurant began to empty, Alistair said, "I have a car outside. May I drive you home?" "What kind of car?" The question seemed to amuse him. "A 1962 Silver Cloud, too. A Rolls-Royce. My grandfather's. I prefer it to modern cars. The older ones were built to be driven, not displayed." They walked out together, past Beatrice and Cress's empty table, past the hostess who looked at Ara with an expression she couldn't quite decode, part surprise, part something softer. Outside, the October air was sharp and clean. Boston in autumn smelled like old brick and dying leaves, a city elegant in its decay. The Silver Cloud was parked at the curb, gleaming under the streetlights. It was the color of gunmetal, understated and perfect. A uniformed driver opened the rear door, but Alistair waved him off and opened it himself. Inside, the car smelled like leather and time. Ara sank into the seat, and for a moment, surrounded by the quiet luxury of a machine that was older than either of them, she allowed herself to breathe. They rode in silence for 3 blocks. Then Alistair reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and withdrew a document. It was bound in a simple black folder. No ornamentation, no logo. He handed it to her. "What is this?" "A proposal." She opened it. The first page was typed in clean serif font. At the top, personal agreement, confidential. Below that, her name. Below that, his. She read the first paragraph, then the second, then flipped to the third page because her hands had started shaking, and she needed to see if the document got worse or better. It got worse. "You want to marry me? I need to be married by my 35th birthday to satisfy the terms of my grandfather's trust, the Harrington Clause. Without a legal spouse, control of Sterling Meridian passes to my uncle's branch of the family. And you chose me. My team identified several candidates. You scored highest across multiple criteria." Criteria. He heard the flatness in her voice and for the first time seemed uncertain. Compatibility metrics, psychological profiling, behavioral analysis. "You had me profiled. I profile everyone. It's how I make investments." She closed the folder. "What were my winning attributes?" "Let me guess. Low social standing, making me unlikely to attract tabloid attention. No family wealth, making me financially dependent and therefore loyal. And my weight?" She looked out the window at the passing lights of Beacon Hill. "Made me grateful. That's the word you're looking for. You chose me because you thought a fat woman would be so grateful for your attention that she'd sign anything you put in front of her." The car was very quiet. The engine hummed, a sound from another century. Through the partition glass, the driver's silhouette was perfectly still. "That's a reductive reading," Alistair said. "Then correct me." He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the folder in her lap, then at her face, and something complicated passed behind his eyes. "I chose you because every other candidate wanted something from me. Money, status, access. You didn't. Your profile suggested someone who would treat this as a partnership, not an opportunity for extraction. My profile suggested someone with low self-esteem who wouldn't fight back. The two are not the same thing. They're close enough." Another silence. The car turned onto Charles Street, and the lights of the public garden flickered through the trees. "You're right to be angry," Alistair said quietly. It was the closest thing to an admission of fault she'd heard from him. "I haven't decided if I'm angry yet," she replied. "I'm still reading the data." He looked at her with something she hadn't seen before, not assessment, not calculation, something rawer, less controlled. As if for the first time in a very long time, Someone had said something he didn't have a prepared response for. "Take the folder home," he said. "Read it. If you're not interested, you'll never hear from me again. If you are, my number is on the last page." The driver stopped in front of her apartment building, a converted brownstone in Somerville with a crooked front step and a mailbox that had rusted shut 2 winters ago. It was not Beacon Hill. It was not Back Bay. It was the kind of building where you could hear your neighbor's television through the wall and the radiator sang opera at 3 a.m. Era got out, the folder under her arm. She turned back to face him through the open door. "For the record," she said, "Rothko isn't wallpaper. He is the silence between words. That's why people cry in front of his paintings, not because of what they see, but because of what they finally allow themselves to feel." She closed the door before he could respond. Upstairs in her studio apartment that smelled like coffee and oil paint, she sat on her bed and read the entire document. Every page, every clause. The salary, $300,000 per year deposited in a private account. The duration, 3 years or until the trust conditions were satisfied. The behavioral expectations, attend social functions, maintain the appearance of a genuine relationship, refrain from public disclosure of the arrangement's nature. And then on page 14, a section marked Candidate Assessment, which contained the analysis that Alistair had implied but not shown her in the car. It was clinical, it was thorough, and it was devastating. Subject demonstrates high intelligence, estimated IQ 140 plus, strong emotional regulation, and a pattern of conflict avoidance stemming from prolonged exposure to familial psychological abuse. Low self-esteem index correlates with reduced probability of contract violation. Subject's physical appearance, BMI 38.2, reduces external romantic competition and media interest, minimizing risk of relationship disruption. Recommended approach. Initial engagement should emphasize intellectual connection to establish rapport, followed by gradual introduction of contractual terms once emotional investment is secured. Ara read it all, every page, every footnote, every clinical reduction of her humanity to a spreadsheet of exploitable characteristics. She didn't cry. She didn't slam the folder shut or storm out of the office or call Alistair and scream. She sat in his ergonomic leather chair in his immaculate office, surrounded by the trappings of his extraordinary wealth. And she felt something she hadn't felt since the night in the restaurant bathroom. Not shame, not sadness, not the familiar bone-deep hurt of being reduced to her body. She felt clarity. This was the man she was dealing with. Not a villain, not a hero, but a man so profoundly incapable of human connection that he'd outsourced it to analysts. A man who saw vulnerability as a variable and intimacy as a risk to be mitigated. A man who had built an empire by never trusting anyone, and who had applied the same principle to his personal life. The anger came later. Not in a flood, but in a slow, controlled burn. It settled into her bones and hardened there, becoming something more useful than fury. If Alistair Sterling wanted a strategic partner, she would be one. She would be the best strategic partner he'd ever had. She would make herself so essential to his world that when the moment came, when she held the cards and he held nothing, he would understand exactly how it felt to be someone else's calculated risk. She placed the file back exactly where she'd found it. She closed the drawer. She walked to her room, changed into her pajamas, and went to sleep. In the morning, when Alistair asked her over breakfast how the P10 review was going, she smiled and said, "It's coming together. I have some thoughts on the negotiation timeline." "Good. I'm listening." And he was. He was always listening. Now that was the irony that kept her awake at 3 a.m. The way warmth and strategy had begun to blur at their edges. Because somewhere between the contract and the Caravaggio arguments and the late-night calls from London, the transactional architecture of their arrangement had started to develop cracks. Not on paper. On paper, everything was clean. In practice, Alistair had begun doing things that weren't in the contract. He remembered that she liked her coffee with oat milk and cinnamon. He'd had a first-edition copy of Lightbound's Botticelli monograph delivered to her desk with no note attached. Only the book, which was note enough. He'd started pausing before speaking, a new habit, as if checking his words against some internal standard she'd imposed without realizing it. And once, during a charity auction, when a socialite had made a comment about dress size within deliberate earshot, Alistair had turned to the woman and said, with the devastating calm that was his signature weapon, The last person who publicly disrespected someone I care about found their name removed from every guest list on the Eastern Seaboard. I suggest you recalibrate. Someone I care about. Not my wife, not my partner. Someone I care about. The words had hung in the air between them for the rest of the evening, unaddressed but not unheard. Ara added this to the calculus she was building. The file, the analytics, the clinical reduction of her worth versus the coffee, the book, the quiet evolution of a man who was learning, in his awkward and imperfect way, to be human in her presence. She didn't know yet which column would win, but she was keeping score. The news reached Cressa through the channels that gossip always travels among the wealthy, a hairstylist who served both the Sterling and the Vance households. Within 48 hours of the information surfacing that Ara was not only living with Alastair Sterling, but was about to be formally announced as his fiancée at an engagement party at the Obsidian Club, Cressa called an emergency meeting with Beatrice. They met at a restaurant neither of them could properly afford anymore, maintaining appearances with the desperate precision of people whose social capital was their only remaining currency. Richard Vance's Chapter 11. Filing had been quieter than most, but in their circles, quiet was loud enough. Invitations had begun to thin. Certain tables at certain restaurants were no longer available. Cressa's ex-boyfriend, a junior partner at a white shoe law firm, had stopped returning her texts. "This is unacceptable," Beatrice said, stirring her coffee with a violence that suggested the spoon had personally wronged her. "That girl has spent her entire life in our shadow, and now she's going to marry into the Sterling family. She's not just marrying in, Mother, she's being introduced at the Obsidian. Do you know what kind of people are members there? I know exactly what kind. The kind who stopped inviting us to things after Richard's little financial adventure." Cressa leaned forward, her eyes bright with the particular energy of someone whose jealousy has calcified into purpose. "I still have contacts. Miranda Chen, Bianca Aldridge, half the girls from Dalton who married into these families. They already don't take Ara seriously. One push and we can make sure she never recovers." What followed was a campaign of social sabotage conducted with the precision and cruelty that Beatrice had perfected over 2 decades of navigating high society. They created a group chat, not on any platform that could be easily traced, but on an encrypted app that Cressa's tech-savvy friends preferred for exactly this kind of operation. Into this chat flowed a curated stream of humiliation, photographs of Ara from high school, heavy and miserable and unflattering clothes, screenshots of her old dating profile with annotations highlighting her weight, fabricated rumors that she had trapped Alastair with a fake pregnancy, speculation about her mental health, comments about her family's finances, and threading through all of it, the persistent poisonous refrain, "She doesn't belong." They planned their masterstroke for the engagement party itself. Through a contact on the club's events team, they would gain access to the venue's presentation system and display the most humiliating images on the main screens during the toast, a public demolition designed to destroy Ara in front of every person whose opinion mattered. What Beatrice and Cressa did not know, because they had never bothered to truly understand their stepdaughter and stepsister, was that Ara had spent 3 months in the orbit of one of the most sophisticated strategic minds in American finance. She had learned to read rooms, she had learned to anticipate moves, and she had learned, from Alastair's own playbook, that the most devastating victories were the ones your opponent never saw coming. 2 days before the party, Ara received an anonymous tip, forwarded through a chain of contacts she'd cultivated at Alastair's social events. The message contained screenshots of Beatrice and Cressa's group chat. All of it, every photo, every fabricated rumor, every vile comment. She read them sitting in the studio Alastair had converted for her use, surrounded by the art books and canvases that had become her sanctuary. She read the words that her family had written about her body, her worth, her right to exist in spaces they considered their own. One message from Cressa stood out. "The funniest part is she actually thinks he loves her. Like a man who looks like that would choose a woman who looks like that if he had any other option. She's his charity project, his tax write-off with a pulse." Ara read it 3 times. Not because it hurt, though it did in the deep structural way that family cruelty always hurts, burrowing past the walls you've built because family knows where the doors are, but because it clarified something she'd been struggling to articulate even to herself. The world had spent 28 years telling Ara Vance that her body was a problem. Her father had said it with scales in diet books left conspicuously on her nightstand. Beatrice had said it with seasoned sideways glances and shopping trips where nothing fit. Cressa had said it with comparisons, standing beside Ara in family photos and making sure the camera caught the difference. Strangers said it with their eyes every day in every room, a constant referendum on her right to occupy space. And Ara had internalized it. Of course she had. You can't swim in that water for 28 years and come out dry. But there was a difference she was learning between carrying a wound and being defined by it. Alistair's analysts had looked at her self-esteem scores and seen weakness. Beatrice and Cressa had looked at her body and seen limitation. None of them had considered the possibility that a woman who had survived that much scrutiny, that much reduction, that much casual cruelty, and still showed up, still put on the green dress, still walked into Aurelius on a Friday night hoping to be seen, was not weak at all. She was the strongest person in any room she entered. She just hadn't known it yet. Now she did. And then she began to plan. The Obsidian Club occupied the penthouse floors of a converted bank building in the financial district. Its membership was curated with the ruthlessness of a private equity portfolio. Only those with verified net worth above a certain threshold, recommended by 3 existing members, and approved by a board that met quarterly to discuss applicants the way generals discuss troop movements. On the night of the engagement party, the club's main room had been transformed. Crystal and candlelight, a string quartet playing Debussy, 300 guests in black tie representing a combined net worth that could have liquidated most small nations. Ara wore red, not the safe, muted red of someone trying to blend in. A deep, arterial crimson custom-made by Margot that turned her body into a statement. The dress didn't apologize for her curves. It celebrated them. It said, I am here, I am this size, and I am not interested in your comfort. When she descended the staircase of the Louisburg Square townhouse, Alistair was waiting in the foyer. He was in black tie, his usual armor, but when he saw her, something happened to his face that no amount of emotional control training could have prevented. He stopped adjusting his cufflinks. His hands dropped to his sides. Don't say anything calculated, Ara warned him. Don't tell me I look appropriate for the venue or strategically dressed for the occasion. He was quiet for a moment, then, you look like a woman who is about to ruin several people's evenings, and I have never found anything more attractive in my life. It wasn't smooth, it wasn't polished. It was the kind of compliment that came from somewhere behind the spreadsheets and the strategy, from the part of Alistair Sterling that was still learning how to be a human being instead of a holding company. That was almost romantic, Otto said. I'm workshopping it. Give me time. You have approximately 3 hours. They rode to the Obsidian Club in the Silver Cloud. The city lights slid past like a film reel. Ara's clutch contained 2 things, a lipstick and a USB drive. One was for touch-ups. The other was for demolition. She stood on the mezzanine level looking down at the room below. From this vantage point, she could see everything, the bar, the stage, the presentation screens that flanked the main space, currently displaying elegant slides of her and Alistair at various events. She could also see Beatrice and Cressa arrive, uninvited, slipping through the entrance with the confidence of women who believed they still belonged in rooms like this. Cressa wore white, because of course she did. She was carrying a small device in her clutch that Ara knew was a wireless transmitter. Alistair appeared beside her on the mezzanine. They're here, he said, his jaw tight. I know, I'll have security remove them. No? He looked at her. Ara! I said no. She turned to face him. In her heels, she was almost his height, and she met his eyes with a steadiness that made him go quiet. You hired me because you thought I'd be easy to control. You kept me because I turned out to be useful. But tonight, Alistair, you're going to learn something about me that wasn't in your analyst's file. What's that? I don't need you to save me. She descended the staircase. The room parted for her, not because they knew what was coming, but because something in her bearing, in the way she moved through the crowd with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had spent her life being underestimated and had finally stopped caring, commanded attention. Beatrice saw her first. She smiled, the small, satisfied smile of a predator watching prey approach. Cressa's fingers tightened around the transmitter in her clutch. The M for the evening, A society columnist whose voice was familiar from a dozen galas tapped the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, we'd like to begin the evening's presentation. This was the moment Cressa pressed the transmitter. The screens flickered. The elegant engagement photos disappeared. But what appeared was not what Cressa expected. Instead of Era's humiliating high school photos, the screens displayed a clean, scrolling feed of text messages, group chat messages, time-stamped, attributed, and organized with the methodical clarity of a legal exhibit. The first message was from Cressa to the group. Has anyone seen Ara's old prom photos? The dress she wore could have doubled as a circus tent, sending now. The room went still. The second message was from Beatrice. If we time it right with the screens, she'll be standing right in front of everyone when they see what she really looks like. Richard always said she was his biggest embarrassment. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Then came the messages that had nothing to do with Ara. Messages where Beatrice discussed bribing a tax accountant. Messages where Cressa boasted about fabricating references for a charity board position. Messages where they insulted by name at least a dozen people who were currently standing in the room, including Genevieve Piton, whom Beatrice had called a doormat with a trust fund, and Martin Piton himself, whom Cressa had described as a useful idiot with a lithium mine. The room's silence deepened. It was not the silence of shock, but of judgment. 300 of the most powerful people in America watching the evidence of two women's pettiness, cruelty, and fraud scroll past like a stock ticker. Beatrice's face had gone the color of ash. Cressa was frozen, the transmitter still in her hand, her mouth open in a silent scream of comprehension. Ara stood at the center of the room. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply stood, her red dress like a flag planted on conquered ground, and let the evidence speak. After 90 seconds, the screens went dark. The room remained silent. Then, from somewhere near the bar, someone began to clap. Not enthusiastic applause, but the slow, deliberate clap of recognition. Others joined, not for Era's revenge, but for the exposure of something they all understood. The architecture of social cruelty that operated behind every smile and every invitation. Beatrice grabbed Cressa's arm and attempted to leave, but they didn't make it far. Not because anyone stopped them physically, no one touched them, no one needed to. The crowd simply turned its back. One by one, like dominoes falling in slow motion, people shifted their bodies away from Beatrice and Cressa Vance, creating a corridor of rejection that was more devastating than any bouncer or any police officer could have been. They walked out of the Obsidian Club in absolute silence, and they would not walk into a room like it again. In the weeks that followed, the consequences unfolded with the quiet inevitability of gravity. Beatrice's name was removed from the patron list of the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Cressa's application to the Junior League was returned unopened. Richard Vance's remaining business contacts, the few who had survived the Chapter 11 filing, stopped returning calls. Not because anyone organized a boycott. No one needed to. In their world, social death was not a dramatic execution. It was a slow deletion, invitations that stopped arriving, tables that were suddenly unavailable, eyes that looked through you as though you had become transparent. Ara heard about it secondhand through the quiet network she'd learned to navigate. She felt nothing about it, which surprised her. No satisfaction, no pity, just the neutral recognition that actions have consequences and that the women who had spent 2 decades teaching her that lesson had finally learned it themselves. The MC cleared his throat. The string quartet resumed tentatively as the room began to exhale. Conversations restarted in low murmurs. Glasses were refilled. The machinery of social normalcy crept back into motion. Then Alistair Sterling walked to the stage. He picked up the microphone with the same calm deliberation he brought to everything. The room quieted again. This time with anticipation rather than shock. I owe this room an explanation, he said, and more importantly, I owe Ara one. He looked at her across 30 feet of polished floor and 300 pairs of watching eyes. He looked at her the way he had never looked at her before, without calculation, without strategy, without the protective architecture of a man who had built his fortune by never being vulnerable. When I first met Era Vance, I made a decision based on data. I had analysts compile reports, I ran projections, I calculated probabilities. I treated the most important decision a person can make, choosing who to share their life with, like a due diligence review. A murmur passed through the crowd. I chose Ara because my data suggested she would be compliant, manageable, grateful. He paused and the word hung in the air like smoke. I was wrong about every single variable. He stepped off the stage and walked toward her, the crowd parting around him. I didn't account for her intelligence, which makes my best analysts look like amateurs. I didn't account for her courage, which is unlike anything I've ever encountered in a boardroom or anywhere else. I didn't account for the fact that she would walk into my carefully controlled world and dismantle every assumption I'd built it on. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could see the scar on his jaw, the one she'd noticed on their first night, close enough that she could see his hands. Those perfectly controlled hands were trembling. I had this speech planned differently, he said, and his voice was quieter now, meant for her, even though the room was listening. I had talking points, strategic messaging. My communications team reviewed 3 drafts. Of course they did, Ara said, and something that might have been a smile crossed her face. But here's what wasn't in any draft. He took a breath. I'm terrified of you. Not because you're intimidating, although you are, but because you see me, the real me, the version that hides behind data and contracts, because he doesn't know how to be human without a spreadsheet. And instead of running, you stayed. And you fought, not for my money or my name, but for the possibility that I could be better than what my own analyst predicted. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small box, not Tiffany blue, not ostentatious, a simple wooden box, old and worn. This was my grandmother's, he said. She married my grandfather in 1952 with nothing but this ring and a conviction that he was worth the trouble. She was right. I'm hoping history repeats. He opened the box. Inside was a ring, a single sapphire surrounded by small diamonds. Clearly vintage, clearly irreplaceable. Ara Vance, he said, I am publicly, irrevocably, and with full awareness that I don't deserve it, asking you to marry me. Not because of a clause or a contract, because you made me want to be someone worth choosing. The room held its breath. Ara looked at the ring. She looked at Alistair's face, open, raw, and more honest than she'd ever seen it. She looked at the room full of powerful people who had watched her be humiliated and celebrated and exposed and vindicated, all in the span of one evening. Then she reached into her clutch and pulled out a document. The contract, the original agreement with its clauses and conditions and clinical enumeration of her exploitable characteristics. She held it up so Alistair could see it. I don't want a transaction, she said, her voice carrying across the silent room. I don't want a partnership based on risk assessment and probability matrices. I don't want to be your optimal candidate. She tore the contract in half. The sound of ripping paper was the loudest thing in the room. If you want me, she said, you earn me. No analysts, no projections, no safety nets. You show up. You're honest. And you let me see the version of you that isn't optimized for public consumption. Alistair looked at the torn contract, then at her, and for the first time in all the months she'd known him, the mask fell completely. Not the small cracks she'd glimpsed before, but a total collapse of the careful architecture he'd built around himself. His eyes were bright. His jaw, that perfect jaw, was working against something he couldn't quite control. I can do that, he said. I'll probably be terrible at it. You'll be terrible at it, she agreed, but you'll show up. That's all I'm asking. And Ara, yes, for whatever it's worth, which I know isn't much given the circumstances, I didn't choose you because of your BMI or your self-esteem index or whatever other metric my analysts reduced you to. I chose you because of 3 paragraphs about Caravaggio that made me feel something I couldn't quantify. And I spent 4 months trying to pretend that wasn't the reason. Because quantifiable things are safe, and you are the least safe person I have ever met. Ara looked at him, at the trembling hands, in the bright eyes, in the absolute ruin of every defense he'd ever built. She thought about the green dress at Aurelius and the bathroom mirror, and the 2 women who had laughed about the girl at table 4. She thought about every room she'd ever entered where someone had looked at her body and decided she didn't belong. And she thought about this room, this glittering room full of the most powerful people in America, where she stood in a red dress with a torn contract at her feet and a billionaire on his knees, and where not a single person was looking at her size. They were looking at her. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, which surprised neither of them, and both of them at once. The room erupted. Not in polite applause, but in something rarer, something that sounded like relief, as if 300 people had just witnessed proof that vulnerability was not, in fact, a weakness. Later, much later, after the guests had gone and the string quartet had packed their instruments and the champagne had been cleared away, Ara and Alistair sat together in a small cafe 2 blocks from the Obsidian Club. It was the kind of place that served coffee in ceramic mugs and had mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that hadn't been updated in months. It was not elegant, it was not exclusive, it was warm, and the coffee was good, and the owner didn't know or care that the man in the rumpled tuxedo was worth $4 billion. Alistair sat across from her, his tie loosened, his sleeves rolled up, the armor of his public self finally set aside. In the fluorescent light of the cafe, he looked younger, more human. The scar on his jaw was more visible here, and she wanted to ask him about it, about a lot of things, about the childhood that had produced a man who couldn't say, "I love you," without running it through 3 drafts first. But there was time for that. There was, for the first time, the possibility of time. "For the record," Ara said, wrapping her hands around her mug, "Rothko is still not wallpaper." Alistair smiled. It was the second time she'd seen him smile, and it was better than the first. Less guarded, more lopsided, the smile of a man who was learning that imperfection might be acceptable after all. "For the record," he replied, "you were never the optimal candidate." "No?" "No, you were the terrifying one, the one who made every projection obsolete." He reached across the table and took her hand, gently, as if handling something precious and easily startled. "My analysts were right about one thing, though." "What's that?" "The probability of you changing my life was 100%. They just didn't know it was in every way that mattered." Outside, Boston hummed its nighttime song, taxis and distant sirens, and the harbor wind carrying salt through the old streets. In the cafe window, their reflections sat together. 2 imperfect people in a perfectly imperfect moment, and neither of them looked away. The cafe owner, a Greek man named Dimitri, who had owned the place for 30 years and had seen every kind of couple pass through his door, set down 2 slices of baklava he hadn't charged them for. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Some things were obvious, even to strangers. Ara ate her baklava. Alistair watched her eat it. The way she closed her eyes at the first bite, the way she didn't apologize for the pleasure, the way she existed in her body with a fullness that had nothing to do with size and everything to do with presence. "I want to tell you something," he said, without running it through 3 drafts first, without running it through any drafts. She set down her fork. "I'm listening." "The night I sat in that corner booth at Aurelius and watched you wait for me, I told you I was observing, assessing. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." "What was the whole truth?" He looked at his hands, those controlled, still hands, and for the first time she saw them open, palms up on the table, as if offering something invisible. "I was afraid," he said. "I'd read your profile. I'd read the assessment. I knew everything about you that could be quantified. But when I saw you in person, sitting at that table in your green dress, checking your phone and trying not to look nervous, something happened that I didn't have a framework for." "What happened?" "I wanted to know you, not your data, you, and that terrified me because I hadn't wanted to know anyone in a very long time." He paused. "So I sat in my corner and I watched, and I told myself I was being strategic, when the truth is I was being a coward. I was hiding behind an observation because walking up to you and saying hello felt more dangerous than anything I'd done in business." Ara looked at him across the scratched surface of a cafe table that cost less than the buttons on his shirt. She looked at the scar on his jaw and the uncertainty in his eyes and the trembling hands that managed billions, but couldn't manage this one terrifying act of honesty. "Alistair." "Yes?" "That's the first thing you've ever said to me that wasn't optimized." "I know, it's awful." "It's perfect." She reached across the table and took his hands, those open, vulnerable hands, and held them in hers. Not gently, not tentatively, but with the firm, grounding pressure of someone who had spent her entire life being told she was too much and had finally found someone who didn't want her to be less. Dimitri turned off the neon open sign. The cafe went quiet. Outside, the first light of dawn was beginning to soften the edges of the Boston skyline, turning the brick and steel from gray to gold. In the window, their reflections held hands, and the glass reflected nothing but the truth. 2 people, neither of them perfect, neither of them finished, sitting in the ruins of every wall they'd ever built, and choosing deliberately, vulnerably, irreversibly to stay. Sometimes the people who've been told they're too much their whole lives turn out to be exactly enough. If this story moved you, you're not alone. Hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because every day there's a new story here waiting to remind you that you deserve to be seen. See you tomorrow.